Okay, we're getting into World War II, and there's quite a bit of lecture in this unit talking about all the different factors that will play us into going back into a world war 20 years after we just gotten done with the war to end all wars, and this one's going to be quite a bit larger. So let's jump into it. We have two things, factors that lead to World War II and then America's isolationism. Post-World War I brought us back into another state of why are we getting involved in world affairs? And I think we should stay out of all things. I don't really care what's going on in Europe. Let's go back to making things. And times were good. Economic times were good, so we focused on economics the first part of the 1920s. Um, right away, right after World War I finished, the United States really killed or weakened the League of Nations. That was the predecessor to the United Nations. And the U.S. Senate refused to sign that treaty, basically because it was going to draw us back into potentially war in Europe or Asia. And so by us not signing that League of Nations treaty, then you made the other countries have not as much power. So the idea of the League of Nations, again, was if you had a country that decided to go rogue and wanted to start doing something that went against international law or against a treaty, all the other nations would get and go against it. No one's going to want to take on all of the world, and so that country would be stopped. But the U.S. Senate said, because it has to ratify a treaty, that, and Mr. Wilson, the President of the United States, had said, this is what we're going to put forth. The Senate said, no, this is going to end up getting us in a war somewhere over in another portion of the world that really doesn't have anything to do with us. So the lack of power or real enforcement by our allies never makes the League of Nations really mean very much. The other thing the United States will do is it will disarm after World War I. We were vastly under prepared for World War I, and I guess the Senate and House decided to do the same thing again. After World War I and in the 1920s, the U.S. Navy, for example, made several agreements with Japan and Britain that it would limit the number of battleships each country could have. The battleship at that time, remember, was the number one ship. They would do a lot of ship-to-ship battles. The aircraft carrier had not come into full attrition yet. And so what they said was, we're going to make a treaty where Britain and the United States would get 5 battleships and Japan would get 3. Now, the loophole to this treaty was that it did not limit the number of smaller ships that each country could have. For example, the number of destroyers, cruisers, and submarines, that was left up to each country. And Japan was becoming more and more imperialistic and more militaristic. And they are vastly farther advanced than we are when we go to war. So we have an advantage in battleships when the war breaks out. They'll have an advantage in destroyers, cruisers, and submarines by far over us. Japan did get guarantees from the United States and Britain that they would not fortify their positions in the Far East. Thus, that gave Japan naval supremacy in their own backyard. And Japan is feeling threatened because they have no energy, they have no oil, they have no rubber. They've seen what happened in the United States and how they've grown, and they are getting their ambitions up. So they will use that. In the 1920s, 30s, to start gaining territory. Next thing that comes about from an economic standpoint, and usually economics is the things that drive us into war, is the loans and reparations. We ended up being the biggest creditor in the world after World War I. We had loaned a great deal of money to countries during the war and then after the war. So the Allies owe the United States $16 billion. And these loans and repayments and demanding France and England to repay those loans, and the repayment plan causes a great deal of friction between Britain and France. Those guys are having to rebuild their economies. Not that their economies were destroyed necessarily, buildings, but they had people, a whole generation wiped out. So there's friction there. And then the Allied group, remember, put on just unbelievable demands on Germany to pay back huge reparations, $32 billion. And that $32 billion that we're just making Germany pay, it causes Germany's economy to completely collapse in 1923, well before the Depression will hit in the United States. Germany then responded by allowing its currency to go hyperinflation. And that's where you just print money off. You just print it and print it and print it. And when you have, excess of it, then the value of it just goes to nothing. So for the example that I used was a loaf of bread in 1923 cost $120,000 in US dollars. That seems to be a little bit of an outreach for bread. Number 5, the Dawes Plan. That was a plan in 1924 where the United States had loaned money to Germany and then had that money rescheduled to pay reparation payments. So the United States takes additional money, gives it to Germany so it can pay back the Allies in France and Great Britain, and then Great Britain and France can pay us. So it's literally a little bit like, paying Peter to pay Paul. And this idea that we're paying with our own money, and it is because Germany has no money to pay. This will continue. The Dawes Plan will kind of solidify the frustration in that in Europe until 1929 when the Depression hits, and then nobody can continue. We don't have the money to make the loan payments to Germany. Germany won't be able to pay Great Britain and France, and that's going to cause a great deal of tension. The peace treaties in the 1920s turned out to be completely ineffective. Most of the treaties in the 1920s to stop aggression and expansion failed because no one would enforce them. If you made a treaty that you weren't going to do anything, and if you did, we were going to come in against you, they ended up doing nothing. And when you don't do anything, you're actually encouraging bad behavior. Next, you had the Kellogg-Briand Pact. That was the United States Senate, and it was between the United States and France. And it declared war to be illegal. Oh, that sounds so nice. We're going to make war illegal except for defensive reasons. Defensive proved to be a major loophole. What's defensive? The fact that you aren't letting me have my water and I'm being stopped from being able to have my full potential. I have to therefore go to war against you. I mean, anything and everything will be justified as being defensive. It's a fantasy land. The big one, though, that comes around is the Great Depression. The Great Depression will come. Ours is in 1929. In Europe, it's earlier than that, 27, 28. But the U.S. stock market crashes on Black Tuesday, and that triggers, an additional worldwide depression. It deepens it in Europe. Germany is completely ravaged. I think 50% unemployment is an enormously kind statement. I think they're worse than that. Japanese exports, which are vital for their economy, fell by 50%, and they are mad at the United States because the United States had put an oil embargo on them because they were starting to reach out into China and start taking things, and tensions begin to rise immensely. The Great Depression, when people don't have money, they do not have money, you're going to find all of a sudden racial tension. You're going to have nationalism rise up. You're going to have religious tension rise up. You're going to have battle between sexes rise up. And that was true when we were in this last recession that we went through. There was the Black Lives Matter movement, or it was the Occupy Wall Street movement, or there was ISIS. And we saw a lot of these different groups. Economic times are considerably better right now. Consequently, I haven't heard much from those groups, or considerably less from those groups. The next one that's going to come about in the late 20s and early 30s is the rise of the totalitarian regime. Totalitarian meaning they control everything. And dictatorships control all facets of the economy, and every portion of someone's life. So you're going to have communism in the Soviet Union, and in Germany and in Italy, you're going to have fascism. Now, they're very, very close, and it's really important that you learn the difference between the two. Fascism glorified the state. Hitler won support because he said, we were sold out. We are a great nation. We are a great people. And a lot of Germans felt that way, that we are great. We are exceptional. Italy, underneath Benito Mussolini, began the same thing in 1922. And the thing that he did was he was able to get people back to work and working again. Japan's economy in the 1920s was absolutely in the tank. And they made a transformation to where the military started to have more and more power. And they took dictatorship power along with the emperor in the 1930s. Germany came underneath the same control underneath Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in 1933. He'd been around from the 20s formulating his party and had become very, very popular. So you have Japan and its military dictatorship, Germany and Adolf Hitler and fascism and the ability to control all facets, and Benito Mussolini in Italy underneath fascism. And then you have, last but not least, communism taking root in the Soviet Union. Now we'll stop there and we'll come back and start looking at what some of the aggressions that took place.